Great. So then I will I will give the floor to my colleague Amalie for a brief presentation and overview of the TransformAr project. Amalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chiara. And do you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Amalie Bjørnevold from the University of Antwerp, which is coordinating the TransformAr project. And I'll provide a brief introduction to the project and what we're doing. So as you can see from the title here, the project is all about accelerating and upscaling transformational adaptation in Europe, specifically on the demonstration of water-related innovation packages. So TransformAr is part of a cluster of Horizon 2020 Green Deal funded projects that started in 2021 that are seeking to support EU climate adaptation policy. So together with Arsinoe, Impetus and Resilience, we're looking to specifically support the EU adaptation mission until next year when our projects finish. And with regard to TransformAr, we're 22 partners across 11 countries. And here you can see in the map the different case studies and demonstrators of the different projects. So in purple, you can see the demonstrators of the TransformAr project, which I'll go into in a moment. So I mentioned the adaptation mission. So the general ambition of TransformAr is to really contribute to this mission on adaptation to support at least 150 European regions and communities in becoming climate resilient by 2030. So specifically, we look to support faster, smarter, and more systemic climate change adaptation through actionable adaptive solutions, actor-driven and impact-oriented adaptation pathways. We are looking to understand acceptability of transformative solutions and a full-scale socioeconomic impact assessment of transformational adaptation has been performed. And as we will discuss today, alternative financing mechanisms to accelerate investments. So as you saw on the map that I showed a moment ago, we have 6 demonstrators and 1 replicator in our project. And all these demonstrators, they tackle climate risks related to water, so floods, droughts, or they're strongly dependent on water use, for example, in agriculture, fisheries, or aquaculture. So what we're doing in TransformAr is developing, testing, and demonstrating solutions and pathways in these territories that are facing water-related risks and impacts of climate change. So with the specific regions that we're focusing on is Lappeenranta, whose replicator is Gjøvik in Norway, Lappeenranta in Finland, Guadeloupe, the French overseas territory, the West Country region in the UK, Oristano in Italy, Galicia in Spain, and Egaleo in Greece. So I mentioned these solutions that the project is working on. So we have 21 solutions specifically that are going to be implemented by the end of the project, so next year. And these are divided into 5 categories. So specifically technological solutions, nature-based solutions, governance solutions, financing and insurance mechanisms, and behavioral change solutions. So today we'll discuss, of course, as mentioned, the financing and insurance mechanisms. And within the project, we have green bonds in the UK, adaptation fund in Guadeloupe, insurance mechanisms, which Fred Hatterman will be presenting in a moment, and choice experiment for investors in stormwater management upscaling in Finland and Norway. So this was just a brief overview of what we're doing in the TransformAr project, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations, and thank you for your attention so far.
Thank you, Amalie. Thank you. Perfect on time. So thank you for this, let's say, brief overview of the TransformAr project. And then let's move to the last speech of, let's say, this first introductory phase. So I will leave the floor to Beatrice Major from Ricardo, representing both the Mission Adaptation and Green Deal Project Support Office, who will tell us a little bit more about the Mission Adaptation months on finance. So Beatrice, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to proceed to share my screen. Let me know when you can see it.
We can see your screen perfectly in presentation mode.
Perfect. So Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to, briefly remind, for those who don't know it, about who is MIP4ADAPT and the work it does in the mission on climate adaptation. And then I will update you on the series of activities that are happening this month, November, related to finance, which is the finance month of the mission. So you can all have access to these webinars and join if you're interested. MIP4ADAPT is the mission implementation platform. So our objective is to help the mission achieve its overall objectives of supporting 150 European regions across Europe to develop their climate adaptation plans and become climate resilient, and also implement and finance, finance for implementation of demonstration projects on climate adaptation across Europe as well. MIP4ADAPT has four types of services. One is we facilitate the community of practice of the mission to share knowledge, identify research gaps, informing policy development, etc. We also provide technical assistance to regions who have signed the Mission Adaptation Charter to develop climate adaptation plans, to identify and apply for funding and finance for climate adaptation projects, and to engage with stakeholders and citizens. We also run the communication channels of the mission through promoting mission projects, activities and events, increasing collective impact, and increase the visibility of all the mission projects results, plus the work of the regions. And then we contribute to the monitoring and evaluation of the mission through collecting data and stimulating the exchange of lessons learned. As I said, one of our roles is to facilitate the community of practice. So there have been 3 events organized this month related to finance for climate adaptation. The first one was held yesterday. It was EU grants for climate resilience, opportunities for regions and local authorities, where several members of the European Commission from different DGs came to present a specific EU funds that are available for local authorities and regions. And also there were some discussions and some examples from specific regions who had applied for this funding. So the event already passed, but the recording will be available in Futurium, which is the platform that the mission uses to share all the information and can be accessed there. The next event is happening on the 19th of November. It's about green participatory budgets. It's a specific stakeholder engagement training, so how to develop participatory budgets bottom up. And the session will include a hands-on exercise to understand how to design and implement these participatory budgets. So I've left here the link to get more information and also register. So you're very welcome to do it. And the last one will be on the 28th of November. It will be about how to combine public and private funding to develop the financing strategies for adaptation projects. And you will get insights into how to effectively combine funding from both sides with presentations from the European Investment Bank, from some private banks, and also get visibility of where to find information about the offers that are available on the mission portal, as well as some specific case studies. So there's also the link here to register and to find more information about it. And just to finish, and I'll be quick, if you have any doubts, just to remind that there is a help desk support available for the community. In the presentation, you will be able to access the link when this is shared, and you're very welcome to submit your questions through the help desk related to events or to the technical assistance delivered by the mission or to any technical aspects about climate adaptation planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you. So thank you for this presentation, and happy to see that, okay, and it's not like by chance that we decided to organize our webinar on climate finance within the mission adaptation month on climate finance. But so now, after this brief introduction, let's move to, let's say, the real core of the webinar. So let's first start with, let's say, a general overview and presentation of the European landscape on climate finance. So we have the pleasure to have with us Stephen Hart from the European Investment Bank. So Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. I'm very pleased to be here. What I will try to do is to give at least a perspective from EIB's point of view on how climate finance has evolved for us, and also how this ties in with, for example, the other topics of nature and adaptation. Now, you may not be aware, but EIB is branded as the Climate Bank, or the EU Climate Bank, depending on what you read. And I think what's been so interesting about that journey is that it wasn't really imposed from the outside. It emerged very much from the culture of the EIB as an institution, as a very technocratic institution, in fact. So I'd like to give you some insight into that, and so just present. No. Right. I guess you can see that. Good. So for those of you who don't know EIB, and I say that because if I'd asked people 10 years ago who EIB was, most of the people wouldn't have known. But we are, in fact, enshrined in the EU treaty. So we are the European Union's long-term finance institution. What that means is that we are owned by the 27 member states. We have our own governance. Our governors are the ministers of economy or finance of the member states. So we are completely rooted inside European policies, and that is quite relevant, actually. So a few years ago, we went out with this bold statement that we will become the climate bank, which in practice really meant trying to set some kind of lending targets or financing targets relating to climate and the environment, without necessarily knowing exactly how we would get there. And what's interesting is that, I mean, EIB has been involved in say climate finance longer than that. We are a technocratic institution, as I said, which means all our projects have always been subject to economic analysis. So we've been using shadow prices of carbon, for example, for a long time, and also trying to climate-proof assess for climate risk. But all this has evolved, of course, in the last few years as the whole sustainable finance agenda really has taken off. You have a whole bunch of new regulations, the taxonomy with do no significant harm, for example. But really the two main aspects are, of course, some lending targets and some safeguards. And one of the key safeguards that we now have to operate with is Paris alignment. And really there was a strong sense within the organization after the Paris Accord that we cannot finance what will effectively become stranded assets. There was a lot of, say, personal, you might say, energy invested in establishing this idea as a climate bank, but it was actually built on very rational arguments, which is literally all these energy production plants cannot become reality. All these climate, say, negative investments, if you add them up, it just doesn't work out with the targets that we've set. So somehow we needed to create a framework. So in addition to lending, we actually look at our counterparts to see if they have say a decarbonization trajectory. We call it the path framework, which is quite new. So we don't just looking at the project, but also at our counterparts, the borrowers, what their plans are. We can also offer, say, assistance in that regard. Maybe another interesting thing that drove EIB into the spotlight was the fact that if you go back to 2019, 2020, we were at the tail end of a very climate negative US administration, which means, our stepsisters like EBRD, like Asian Development Bank and so on, who had the US as shareholder, were really having to pull their punches on climate. But EIB, as a pure European institution, could go full throttle, and in fact that was, not a negligible driver really that propelled us, you might say, in that sense. I said, it's not a smooth process when you set these bold targets and you don't have a complete plan, but what we then developed was a climate bank roadmap, which was trying to at least set out the steps that would take us towards these targets. And one of the more contentious areas was, of course, adaptation. And I say contentious. If you go to a loan officer and you talk about bold investments like wind farms, technology for biofuels, it resonates with your financer. It's got scale, it's bankable, they can relate to it, they can get on board. If you start talking about adaptation to bankers, they rather struggle with this. And of course, one of the reasons is that adaptation is so mind-bogglingly more complex than mitigation. And half the story is actually recognizing adaptation investments when they're there. One thing that you might say is a bit of a no-brainer is that there's a fairly good understanding that adaptation revolves very closely around the water cycle. So water investments can easily be identified, climate proofed, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, there was a pretty strong indication that we needed to educate internally, but also externally. And so we established an advisory platform around that. So this notion of trying to finance adaptation with special tools is actually not new. A decade ago, we kind of signed the final documents on launching what we call the Natural Capital Financing Facility. It became operational in 2015, and it was, in fact, it had two legs. One was biodiversity, and the other was nature-based climate adaptation, which actually made it the first dedicated financing instrument. And very early on, this whole linkage between nature and adaptation was recognized. In that sense, it was a bit of a first mover. And we've gleaned, of course, enormously important lessons about trying to finance these two areas. What the main challenge really here is that these are areas that are not really market driven. You don't have strong markets behind nature or adaptation. And so it really comes down to trying to find funding streams, combined funding streams. And this is a bit of the challenge that I'm going to talk about in a minute. We applied all in a way, the financial techniques are known. But what we're trying to do is apply them to new areas like adaptation and biodiversity. And I think we succeeded quite well. And in fact, you can see a pretty good summary of the lessons of that in the report that we wrote last year. We published this report specifically on nature-based solutions. So in the last 2 years, or the last few years actually, nature-based solutions became a very prevalent, you might say, policy objective across the board inside the Commission. So DGRTD commissioned this study really to pull together all the lessons from the NCFF, but also to take a snapshot of the market and who the players would be in the different landscapes. So we interviewed asset managers, project developers, and so on, just get an idea of was the LinkedIn feed representative? Was all the wonderful storytelling there really representative of what was happening in the market? And we tried to explore that. I will save you the 130 pages. Actually, when you talk about nature or climate, it all comes down to how you break down the landscape, really. And so in order to write this report, we had to, think of some way of classifying landscapes. the main and not very surprising finding was, of course, that private finance is still really a very small component of what's flowing into these kind of projects. One interesting observation, which is highly relevant today, is that of all the landscapes, say agricultural landscapes actually receive a lot of funding labeled as eco schemes or for nature-based solutions. Now, the negative here is that really the effectiveness of a lot of that funding is questionable. Even the European Court of Auditors has questioned this. The positive is that those funding levels are so considerable that if put to good use, they can make a massive difference actually in farm landscapes. Most private investors are still trying to get their head around climate. They haven't really got around to adaptation or biodiversity. In general, there's always this issue of the size of investments, which is a challenge for bankers. You know, they need big projects. There's also a huge confusion really in terms of language, which is also relevant, you know, for adaptation and nature finance, which is people tend to mix up the concepts of funding, which is the ultimate source of where money comes from. So it's user fees, it's taxes, and financing, which is really the trickery that bridges expenses with the income. So you might need upfront financing, and then you be able to repay later, right? And people mix these concepts. The common thread really is that a lot of projects have some revenues that can be monetized, but fall short. So it's not so much that nature or adaptation is not revenue generating at all. It's just that it's not sufficiently revenue generating really. And what you can understand from that is that, you know, even some supplementary revenues can make a big difference. In a way, it can lift a situation of not doing anything to doing something, or changing the whole management regime. So the bottom line here is that this is a funding problem, not so much a financing problem, and really trying to stack different sources of funding together is the challenge that we're trying to address. So the other systemic issue here is the competition for land. And I think the flooding in Valencia, last year's flooding in Thessaly, and so on, I think is challenging the public perception, because if journalists, when they see these events, they immediately think about climate. They don't think about land use. And it's sad in some ways, because land use is something that we can address. It's something present, it's something practical, you know, we can actually deal with. And the future really is about this competition for uses, for multi-use, multi-purpose landscapes, and establishing the agreements and the relationships to achieve multiple goals. I won't go too much theory, but clearly, you know, other sectors that are built on public goods, you know, are subject to a lot of regulation, and regulation has actually, you know, it's provided us with safe planes, good roads, safe water, and it is ultimately what will shape real markets around this. It's not sufficient that people become more educated, more aware. Actually, you know, at some level, you need to create the parameters of new financial flows, new funding streams through regulation. There are some sectors that just work better. And if you take the water sector and forestry, they are inherently based on long-term decision-making. So they can incorporate what to wider society might seem like externalities, but I mean, when you cover very large footprints, very large timeframes, these externalities really become your business. Forestry in particular is based on valuation models, for example, that forests can change hands, but the value of forests are the future, say the future sale of timber, for example. So some sectors just work better with the whole nature and climate agenda than others. In general, what's missing is support for the early stages. Now, in other areas like venture, we're familiar with the whole language of a financial ecosystem, for example, seed financing, early growth, late growth, scaling, ABC rounds. That whole logic is there, but that's because that there's a market to create that differentiation, and we don't have that ladder really. And the first rung of the ladder is missing when it comes to things like nature and adaptation, which is that the first initial capital to build those initial partnerships, to try things out. And so we're bringing this experience into the next multi-annual financial perspective. So obviously we're building on the lessons of the NTFF and so on to define what instruments should be designed, for example, to serve the naturation law, but also agriculture has become a big topic, and many of the same questions are there, also for adaptation. A question how to work as a big bank with a topic like adaptation. I mean, we're trying to do this more systematically. Now, typically a bank will just wait for projects to arrive, and you might not know where they came from, frankly. Now, with our advisory services, we're moving more and more upstream. But the question is how to do this in an efficient way as a financing player, right? Projects are at different stages of maturity. Some can be too small. Some have a line of sight, you might say, to something which has sufficient scale. So the idea is really to embrace attrition, you might say, but do it systematically. And one of the key ways that we see the way forward, of course, is to work with others who are maybe better suited at the initial stakeholder work, and then at some point, we can enter into the picture with our advisory and our financial expertise. So it follows very much the venture logic, actually, which is you invest some time, and then if there's traction, there's more promising, then you invest more time and resources, and then you ramp up the level of support. We're also looking at exploring financial techniques. Now, I mentioned that financial techniques are not the core of this. It's really about how to get more funding into it. But nevertheless, if you're trying to drive impact, it is worth considering what kind of financial techniques are enablers of adaptation processes. And because adaptation really is so complex, it's quite, it's what one can imagine that providing some form of performance-linked finance allows at least some kind of creativity and innovation in how to deliver on adaptation objectives. And that's reflected to some extent in some of these ideas. And then in general, to reconsider how to blend in the most efficient way so that it's targeted. I mean, adaptation finance has potential to be just off the scale expensive. The cost of adapting our societies potentially maybe an order of magnitude higher than even mitigation and decarbonization. And clearly, the response has to be that we do things efficiently, so we achieve multiple objectives in the same landscapes. And we are very, very targeted about the kind of risks that we're willing to say cover. We've had discussions with the insurance sector, for example. Now, the insurance sector has its own limitations, I would say, but it's trying to innovate. Insurance, believe it or not, is not particularly concerned with the situation 10 years from now, but in the next 12 months, because those premiums are actually annual. But we're all trying to come together, and I don't think anyone can solve this alone. So the latest, as I say, fruit on the tree is agriculture, and we're also trying to bring some of these thoughts into really how we can experiment and design for how to support the agricultural transformation, which is, you know, as linked to all these climate risks and transformational risk as the other topics. I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. It's a lot of topics, so I hope I've given you some impression at least of what we're doing.
Thank you, Stephen. No, thank you with this, let's say, inspiring and comprehensive overview of adaptation finance and of the work you have been carrying out in the EIB. As I will take the chance to reiterate Stephen's message. If you have any question, please don't be shy. You can also drop all your questions in the Q&A box. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will have 2 Q&A sessions, so we can try to address at least as much as possible all your questions. And just a clarification, because I received this question, we will try to make the slides also available. We then need to identify how, but then we will follow up and provide you more details on this. So after this great overview from Stephen, then we can start with the presentation from the different European projects. So I will leave the floor to our colleague Linda Romanowska from University of Antwerp and the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, who will provide us some, let's say, insights on the analysis of bankability of adaptation projects within the TransformAr project. So I will share Linda's slides. So in the meantime, Linda, the floor.
Thank you, Chiara. I hope everyone's hearing me. If not, let me know. It is absolute pleasure and also very fitting to be following after Stephen, as in this work that we are doing in TransformAr, we are very, very much building on the fantastic and very, very detailed work done by EIB, especially the report on nature-based solutions. That has been quite inspirational for us, and we're very much using that information and trying to take a step further and looking how we can gain more insights on certain specifics around adaptation finance and nature-based for adaptation related finance, but and also start working towards what are the solutions, what are needed solutions, what are priority solutions, and what we as a research community can do for that. On myself, I wear many hats in the TransformAr project. I am participating through University of Antwerp. Chiara also mentioned, I am appointed to the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, where I'm also tasked with convening the adaptation expert group. So all the technical experts that have adaptation background in the platform, and together we are working and trying to progress everything that relates to adaptation in the EU Sustainable Finance Framework, namely the taxonomy, but also other elements of that policy-making framework. So in this work, I have been leveraging both my research work, but also this policy-making work on EU level. I do similar policy-making work in other jurisdictions around the world as well on sustainable finance. But then I also really leverage my direct engagement with private sector and financial services actors, as I'm also a consultant to them. I do advise them on their sustainable investment frameworks and strategies. And I'm also myself appointed to be in an investment committee of a sustainable investment funds, helping make those investment decisions. So having all these different perspectives have really helped me through this work that we are doing. Chiara, if you go to the next slide, that will illustrate what we are doing practically. So in TransformAr, we are running also rounds of interviews with private sector financial services representatives. We're looking at different types of capital providers. We're looking at investors that are primarily focused on equity or private or public debt related financing. We also look at lenders from the banking sector. And I've also had conversations with insurance sectors, but really from their investment function perspective, not so much their insurance, as that is a whole separate work stream that Fred will also be presenting on. Geographically, we are looking at investors that are both based in EU and outside of EU, because of course foreign investors also provide funding for EU projects and vice versa. So it's also interesting to look at those geographic differences. And in a true spirit of EU collaboration, we are closely collaborating with Invest for Nature project, where I'm also contributing, and this is where we are running surveys. That number of responses is incorrect. Do take 10 off, but it's also outdated. And the last time I checked, we're already over 70 responses in that survey currently. And again, broad geographic focus there. The focus in Invest for Nature is more on in nature-based solutions for adaptation, but both projects are quite complementary to each other. And what I'll be speaking through in the next slides will draw from insights from both of these exercises. So I will be covering 6 themes today that have emerged from these conversations and surveys, and talk through some of the insights, and some of them will validate what Stephen has been talking about, what in terms of what EIB has been doing, and some of the things go in some additional topics. So when we talk about, when we set the scene with these interviewees, we always ask them, do you use the term investable or bankable? And what does this mean for you? And what we realize is that for different types of entities, it does mean different things. And some of them don't even use those terms. They may use terms such as eligible or suitable, or they use a wide variety. So there is no one definition and no one set of parameters, but almost all of them will have these 2 pillars of different parameters that they consider, that will be financial parameters and sustainability parameters. Now, does every single one of them consider sustainability parameters? Not necessarily, but many do. And it may be quite surprising how this has really become a true reality in financing providers, that many of them do one way or another consider sustainability parameters, even if just from the risk management perspective, to manage their investment risks, they do consider, for example, also climate change impact on their investments. So financial parameters, very typical, will be the parameters linked with financial stability and performance, such as your financial history, credit ratings, cash flow projections, very run-of-the-mill type of considerations that an investment or lender would usually consider in their investment decisions. There's also quite a lot around organizational attributes. And what was really interesting is also that the existing relationships play a strong role. If the lender or financing provider already has worked with the recipient, they are much more confident to also provide other lending and financing to them, even if it's then linked with more riskier or less understood types of targets and where that funding really goes. So the insight and the point here really is that relationships go a long way, and it's really a good idea just to be building those relationships with different financial services, especially if you're, let's say, a local community or a private sector company that you anticipate, that you would need this funding in the future. Then leveraging whatever existing relationships you already have is always a very good idea. Sustainability parameters are also quite interesting. Many of the players that we have been speaking to and that have been responding to our surveys do have their own sustainable finance frameworks and objectives in place. Now, they're quite different because historically, we didn't have one agreed framework. And then financial market participants have developed their different approaches. Many of them use various existing frameworks, such as principles-based, Equator principles or PRI principles, or they also many link their objectives with SDGs. And increasingly, as we are having more formalized frameworks in Europe, namely the EU taxonomy and sustainable finance frameworks, they are starting to shift towards more aligned, more similar approaches in how they define of what a sustainable investment is. The level to which extent these sustainability parameters are being considered really, really depends on internal knowledge and capacities. And as Stephen already pointed out, the objectives are absolutely not equal. And certainly there's way more expertise and understanding of mitigation related projects and finance, and adaptation is one of those topics that unfortunately does tend to trail behind, although it's very much part of those considerations, or at least formally put in them. Interestingly, although in financial parameters, credit ratings were being mentioned, in the sustainability parameter side, ESG ratings were comparatively rarely used. They were used for when the investments being made are investments in public securities, so listed company shares. This is where there would be less direct interaction with the recipient, and therefore they use proxies, and in this case, those are ESG ratings, which again raises certain questions around whether ESG ratings should be more comparable between themselves, and perhaps also more transparent about their methodologies, which is exactly what they use, also trying to look into with the draft regulation on ESG ratings regulation. Next slide, please. So this next slide looks at, so this is absolutely the case that sustainable finance frameworks and explicit consideration is certainly more present in larger, more established institutions. Smaller investment funds and intermediaries, even if they are by their nature sustainable, they do not necessarily have a formalized framework. They simply do the right thing. And then primarily consider the financial parameters, right? So that was also a really interesting approach, that not always this is formalized, and not always there's clear set of parameters behind it or clear objectives behind that. Next slide, please. So this talks about what is typically included in sustainable finance frameworks by private sector financial services entities. And we do see that very typical mitigation. It is dominating sustainable investments. Quite understandably, it's much more well understood. What is encouraging is to see also social topics, which is very much speaks to adaptation as well, because adaptation in its essence also has a social benefit. And so there is a lot of opportunity here to link these more traditional, more understood topics with adaptation as a less understood theme for investment providers. So what emerges is adaptation is very often mentioned or included in these frameworks, but is way less operational and actually actively being implemented. It's very often just hanging in there as a placeholder, but the parameters are not in place, the investments have not been made, simply because it's harder to address that. However, it is sometimes being integrated, and actually quite often being integrated in other types of investments that fall under the other sustainability themes and topics. And so that is quite an encouraging view, that even though direct investments in adaptation are still lagging behind, indirect co-benefit type of investments in adaptation certainly are taking place. We go to the next slide, please.
And Linda, if you can go a little bit because we're
behind time. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, can do that. Right. So this is really interesting. Is what kinds of recipients could there be out there and could be considered to enhance resilience in our societies and communities? So what emerged here is really three types of recipients that we could be thinking about and also what types of instruments or what kind of problems or issues could be linked, or opportunities could be linked with these three types of recipients. The first, what we're talking about, is project or entity level resilience, meaning providing capital to climate-proof certain projects or entities that are primarily targeting other objectives. So I talk about that adaptation is very often a co-benefit or add-on to other objectives. So this is exactly what we're talking about here. And this is very often already a baseline requirement in project finance. When financing providers are providing funding, they want their investments to be resilient in the future. And that's a really encouraging trend that we see. The problem here is that very often it's hard to separate out the adaptation component. And if you want to track adaptation finance, that is very often to do that in these kind of recipients. But the funding is there, it is being channeled into more resilient, let's say, project infrastructure or whatever that project is about. Second, the middle target could be individual resilience measures that are being implemented by, let's say, companies local authorities, could even be households. And that is much more problematic. We're rarely seen, and it is rarely seen as a suitable investment on its own by investors. There is no clear revenue. So all these different issues that Stephen so clearly laid out are part of this. And a lot of our respondents said that this would be better suited for general lending. So general lending to companies that is lent not on the basis of this being adaptation finance, but on other basis, on financial, let's say, considerations, is probably better suited to this kind of adaptation investment. What is, however, also really encouraging is the third type of recipient, which is different entities providing adaptation solutions, so-called enablers of adaptation in the market, that are certain companies, let's say, that provide or engineer flood protection measures, or they provide software or early warning systems. So these kind of startups and companies that provide useful services that enhance the resilience of the whole community. And that is of really high interest of capital providers. What they are saying is a lack of suitable pipeline. They're not seeing enough of these type of companies for them to invest in. If you click, then you will see the sort of the bottom line on, if you click here, the bottom line will appear. And these are the issues that we need to be working on to resolve the pipeline and the flow of capital towards three types of recipients. If you go forwards, I'm trying to go fast through the slides. This is the different type of mechanisms that have been voiced as most suitable for these three types. If the first category really is the project infrastructure finance, special purpose lending, also labeled public debt, meaning allocation of proceeds types of bonds with specific recipient projects of those funds, that typically is being voiced as the most suitable types of mechanisms. For the individual measures, as I said, private lending, general institutional lending, but this is where the most conversation around de-risking and also partnering was taking place. And exactly as Stephen also laid it out, this is where a lot of collaboration would need to happen between the entities that implement adaptation measures and the ones that could be providing the capital. In some cases, asset-based finance was also being mentioned as possible, but that is only possible where these assets are, let's say, machinery that have a resale value, for example. Enabling resilience is mostly most fitted to equity type of investments, and this is where we can be talking through these traditional stages that Stephen also mentioned, so 3 seed and venture capital growth stage investments. But there are certain parameters that also would need to be in place for these kind of players to be interested in these investors. And therefore, we're saying the sustainable impact and responsible investors will be more interested in these type of startups or growth stage companies. Next slide, please. Key challenges. So what we did also, we just click through so that all the contents of the slide appear. There should be 4. What we also ran past, well, what are the key challenges, meaning if we have the long list of challenges that was already identified in the EIB report, when we present it to the financial services participants, which ones of them they really pick out as the most urgent and most burning ones. And of course, they talk about the financial economic, the scale that was already discussed in detail, creditworthiness and financial viability of the recipients, monetization challenges, how do we generate that revenue stream, also very well explained by Stephen. There's also talk about supply and demand in the market. Interestingly, some of them, there was a bank that was speaking about, they tried to develop a lending product specifically for adaptation, but there was no demand for it. And so they dropped the idea because it just was not something that the market saw as necessary. And also they point out that there's fragmentation in needs and adaptation. There will be many entities implementing small adaptation projects, and it's not very easy for a funding provider to understand, well, what kind of instruments do these different types of entities and different types of adaptation measures actually need, and that's a problem. Knowledge certainly is being also mentioned as an issue, especially internal capacities in the financial sector, but then policy making is being mentioned again and again. And if we go to the next slide, which talks about solutions, then the top 3 solutions, 2 out of the top 3 talk about policymaking. And we in the research community think that, well, if we provide more information, we provide better tools and better understanding of adaptation measures and assessment and cost benefit, things will be resolved, right? The more information the investors will have, the more they will have the ability to invest in these targets, but that is not necessarily the case. Again and again, investors told me that what they first need is clear policy making and stable policy background and clear targets and objectives, so that they have this investment security. When I spoke with EU-based financial services, there was unanimous support for better integration of adaptation in sustainable finance taxonomies and frameworks. The EU taxonomy, it already has a fair amount of adaptation integrated. There is call for doing it even more and better, but also advocating for that to be done in other jurisdictions that currently do not include adaptation. As adaptation finance, obviously, it needs to be global, and it has to be more harmonized among these different frameworks and taxonomies around the world. Clear adaptation plans and regulatory clarity, absolutely essential. That was said, if a country doesn't have a national adaptation strategy and a local level, we don't understand where this whole machine is moving towards, we will not be very convinced that that what we're investing is right, and that actually matches where the whole country is trying to go in terms of resilience. Interestingly, there was also support for mandatory climate-related disclosures for companies, because again, very often this adaptation finance is an add-on finance for companies, and therefore investors want to know how exposed their investments are to climate change risks and what kind of support their target investees may need to also support their resilience and adaptation measures. And they're happy to readily support that, but they need that information from the companies themselves. And there was certainly support for those mandatory disclosures. Some of the other issues are around designing and structuring the investments. It's, yes, aggregating small-scale projects, leveraging public-private partnerships. And I will stress it again, these things need collaborations. Unfortunately, what is happening right now, the financing holders, investors sit on one side, the project implementers sit on the other side. The investors wait for the projects to come to them and already well structured and already perfectly designed. The project investors wait until the investors come to them with their money, right? And they're not necessarily working together enough. EIB is doing a great job in working together with the recipient. The private sector is not doing that yet, and absolutely necessary that needs to happen for us to actually finally activate that flow of capital. And the next slide just talks about the other three key priorities. And only here in spot number 4, we have the knowledge, where this is where the scientific community really comes in, providing robust evidence, methodologies that is necessary for making more informed investment decisions. And again, the knowledge and investment design come in here. So I think that this is all that I wanted to share with you. I think there are some really interesting opportunities here. Enablers are really of interest to investors. Adaptation as an add-on to every other investment is a real opportunity. Coming together, working together for those types of investments where we need better structuring, and then policy making, advocacy, and sustainable finance frameworks on national or international level are really important here. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for this great presentation. So as during the, let's say, previous presentation, the insurance sector has already been mentioned. So I have the pleasure to give the floor to Fred Atterman from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact. So Fred, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine. And we
Okay.
can see your presentation, so go ahead.
Very good. And yeah, thanks a lot. I'm here to present the work we do in TransformAr around insurance. A bit about my background. I'm a natural scientist, but since 20 years, we are now cooperating with the insurance sector. And this is, I guess, why I'm here and where I'm involved in the project. So yeah, a bit about the background. The insurance sector clearly sees and feels the burden which comes with climate change. This is here, for example, from Swiss Re. You know, the reinsurers are the ones insuring the primary insurers, and in the end, they pay the bill, and they, of course, also have then also a longer perspective beyond 1 year. And what you see here is the increase in damages simply, and damages caused by natural disasters. A bit more about the background. This is a quote from the German Insurance Association. And also they say that they clearly see that there are more claims related to natural disasters, and it is often not really the big flood, the big event, but also the sum of many, many smaller events, hailstorms, for example. Yeah, and there's another quote, but this is from one of the world's largest car manufacturers. And they say that next to the financial sector, natural disasters are currently the biggest threat they have. The biggest production risk, and this is often due to the global transportation networks. Everything is just in time and so on. So background, why insurance? Why do we discuss the role of insurance? Climate change obviously increases the risk of being affected by storms, floods, and so on. And even if we adapt our infrastructure to the new extremes, this will take years, possibly decades. And we will possibly then lag behind the extremes which will prevail in, say, 10 years or 20 years. So we are always a bit behind. As a result, dealing with the consequences requires huge financial efforts to compensate for the losses. And here is where insurance has attracted much attention lately as a tool in the context of climate change and adaptation. And of course, in addition to financial compensation, there's another role insurance has, and this is, for example, that they can provide incentives to reduce risk, for example, by having premium contracts if adaptation measures are implemented. Are there lessons learned already? So the role of insurance is of intense debate, and yes, there seem to be some elements which are very beneficial when trying to increase insurance coverage. And there's, for example, an EU report, which I cite here, where some of these topics are listed. Yeah, and this is where we step in as a project. So the idea was to have a look at beneficial measures to increase insurance coverage and insurance by stakeholders, and to take stock of how widespread these measures are really implemented in the European insurance landscape. We had a look at the demonstrators, and they are listed here on the right side of TransformAr, but also, of course, at the national and international scale. Yeah, and these are some of the topics, or most of the topics we considered in the questionnaire. These are the promising measures we wanted to take stock of. For example, improved access to nature hazard-related insurance. Is it there at all? Then insurance policies to increase natural disaster insurance. An example is, for example, bundling of offers in one offer. Then premium incentives and discounts. For example, if adaptation measures are implemented. Of course, there's also community engagement and education important, public-private partnership we talked already about. Catastrophe bonds are in some places, some areas, some countries in place. There could be also aligned and specific streamlined offers, for example, to cities or other sectors, agriculture and so on. And there are some other elements we had an interest in. I only browse now through two of the topics to give you a flavor of how the results look like. And the first one was about whether there is an insurance offer at all across Europe, and looking at floods, for example, but also the same as for storms. There seems to be quite nice offer and availability of insurance, but then looking, for example, at droughts, and droughts are and really a strong impact of climate change. This is much less so. So the coverage and the offers related to droughts are much smaller and often not there. Forest fire is mostly available in southern countries, although it happens now, of course, also in northern countries, but the offers are in place mostly in countries such as Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and so on. There are other perils we had a look at, and for example, hail is available in most countries. There are also exceptions, and one exception is a demonstrator we have in Guadeloupe, which is an overseas department of France. in the Caribbean, and there seems to be astonishingly a general lack in insurance offers. The second topic, insurance policies to increase insurance coverage. And this is, for example, that in individual offers and or more promising than individual offers is to have them bundled in one offer, so that this offer then provides insurance against storms, floods, hail, and so on. And it is also good to increase coverage if they are linked, or if an offer is linked to a more frequently taken insurance, for example, household contents insurance or fire insurance, if you would get it in addition with it. And we found that this is in place in some countries at least. And for example, in Finland, natural perils are part of a natural events insurance bundling offer. And in Norway, for example, there's a Natural Damage Compensation Act, which covers most of the natural damage events, most of the climate change related perils. In other countries, there are similar things in place, for example, in Spain, Italy, and Greece. Yeah, but what is not so often there is that extreme weather insurance is connected to a far more common product, for example, fire insurance also. So I come now already to my conclusions. Indeed, insurance can play an important role in the context of climate change and adaptation, but there are still gaps in insurance coverage, which we could spot. But it seems also to be so that there are more offers than many end users or stakeholders are aware of. So this is also important that there's awareness rising. But insurance itself also plays an important role in raising awareness when it comes to climate change. And they really take also this responsibility and do it. And a measure now widely discussed is compulsory insurance, so that you are forced to be insured. But the concern of the insurance sector is that governments stop or do not enough to counteract climate change and to implement adaptation and to work in precaution. But they simply, in a convenient way, point at insurance. We don't adapt, we don't mitigate enough, but you could have an insurance. And this is a concern the insurance sector has, especially when it is around compulsory insurance. And what they also see more and more is that there are social aspects. So what is with poor people, for example, and they also see more and more their responsibility not only to adapt, but also to, when they finance, for example, insure investments, also in the context of mitigation of climate change. Yes, thanks. You will find these learning stories in the report we have prepared in TransformAr. Yeah, and with this, I would like to stop, and and the floor would be open for questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Fred. And then let's move to, let's say, the last presentation of this first session. So I will give the floor to my colleague Valentina De Chico from CSCC, who will present us the work carried out within the ClimateFit project. So Valentina, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. I think now you can see my screen. So yeah, I will talk to you about ClimateFit, which is a European project looking at at unlocking financial strategies and mechanisms for climate adaptation. So the ClimateFit is recognized the fact that there is a need
Valentina,
for
sorry, we cannot see your slide anymore.
Can you see them now? Sorry.
Yes, now
okay.
Yes. Great.
So we recognize that there is a need for urgent and accelerated action to adapt to climate change, and that the investment related to climate adaptation need to be scaled up, but the public budgets alone will not be able to do so, and therefore it is more and more important to involve the private sector. And to fill this gap in financing for climate adaptation, ClimateFit wants to build capacities, facilitate collaboration, and provide the critical insights. And for this, we work with 20 public authorities divided in 3 different clusters across Europe. You can see them here in the map. And the idea is to support both public authorities and financial entities by providing capacity and knowledge to attract public and private funding, and on the financial entity side to help them identify and assess climate adaptation investments. So from the beginning of the project, we started taking stock of funding and financing barriers and enablers for adaptation, and looking at best practices as what works well. Now we are working on the development of investment strategies for these 20 public authorities, starting with the 4 lead territories at the moment. And then we will continue working on the development of 10 investment plans that will really support the negotiation and the articulation of financial agreements between PAs, the public authorities, and financial stakeholders. So in this session, we will focus on the design of the investment strategies, which are defined as a set of strategic principles to help the public authorities to increase their financing and investments in climate adaptation using a systemic and catalytic approach, with the goal of aligning the interests of the 2 parts, of the PAs and the financing entities. For this, we try to develop a methodology, which is a document that identifies this systemic and catalytic approach and helps PA to translate the local adaptation strategies into actual investment strategies. So it is envisaged as a pragmatic and very hands-on guidance to prioritize investments and starting to identify and articulate funding and financing. Therefore, to do so, we recognize that it is important to be comprehensive, so include all the different aspects that are important, but at the same time flexible, because PAs are at very different stage across Europe, across countries, but also inside the one same country. They're at different stage. They have different level of knowledge and experience in climate adaptation. So we wanted to be as comprehensive and as flexible as possible. Therefore, we identified 10 key modules. We call them modules that can be also independently considered, and they want to provide guidance and resources, examples, and like hands-on template for PAs to directly focus on what they need to develop more, and that they don't really need to follow like a specific timeline or a specific step one after the other, but also there can be like feedback loops that reinforce each other, and that can lead to changes on the way. So now I will delve a bit more into these different steps, starting from the first module. It is the assessment and prioritization of climate risk and sectors, which should be like the starting point, starting first from documents that are already available. For example, like local adaptation strategies that identifies the climate risk the PA is facing and the sectors that would be more affected by it. But also, if that is not available, PAs can look at plans and strategies at a higher level and try to tailor and adapt them to identify the risks and sectors that are more impacted in their territory. Then the second modules will be the overview of the context in which the public authorities operate. And we listed here some elements that we think are important to be considered, like the regulatory framework, the policy priorities, the conditions and constraints at local level, the different mechanisms of transfer of powers, and also it's important to put together all the experiences and the knowledge of the departments inside the PA itself, because we recognize there is really a silo approach with respect to climate adaptation, and therefore different experiences can be brought together to be scaled up and bring the knowledge together. The third modules looks at the identification of the barriers and therefore also the solutions to these barriers that are typical to each of the PAs. And also it's important to identify which actors needs to be involved to face these barriers. Then on the fourth module looks at the identification of a long list, a kind of possible wish list of adaptation options that can be used to address the risks identified before. For example, starting from what has been already done. I mean, it is important always to build on what was already developed. And as well, there are also like different options, different catalogs at the European level that can help public authorities to identify these solutions, these adaptation options. Once those are identified, it's important to look to have a first idea and a high-level estimation of costs and benefits, which is the other module. Starting with trying to gathering as much as possible information from the PA's department. So also here trying to break in the silo approach and reviewing similar projects. But also we want to stress here the fact that at this stage, this would be only like a light touch approach with ranges and in order to have an idea of the order of magnitude of such options. Then on the other side, it's important to look in the other module at the identification of the financing gap, therefore tracking what is already available at the PA levels through planned expenditure, lines of budgets, to determine what is the difference between the estimated costs and what is already available to determine the gap. And here is really important the involvement of the financial department of the PA. Another key element, another module is the time horizon of investments, because as it happens for the estimation of costs and benefits, it's also important to understand like the timeline of the investments and of the projects, trying to determine whether it is more like short term, medium term, or long term, and also for let's say a long term projects, how this can be divided, let's say, into different steps. Then another thing that is really important is for PA to build knowledge on the financial entities and instruments that are available, that are out there, and that can be potentially implemented. Because we see there is a lack of knowledge in this space, and it is really important to look at different elements like the types of instruments, the typical characteristics of these instruments, and also the types of entities that could provide those. Then one of the last modules would be to put together like all the informations that have been collected, trying to have let's say a preliminary matchmaking of the types of adaptation options that have been long listed, and the range of possible sourcing and instruments that could be put together. Among the instruments, we kind of develop an investment compass to try and guide this first matchmaking. And also here is important to look at the characteristic of the instruments, the characteristic of the options, and the possibility of combining and bundling different options and different financing instruments. The last modus is we put it last, but it's really like overarching the whole methodology, because it covers like governance and the resources, so the identification of a governance structure, like the identification of responsibilities, and it is really important to stress the choral effort and the shared responsibility among the different departments. So this is the stage of the methodology up to now, and now what we are doing is to trying to start to apply it and implement it in 4 leader territories. So 4 PAs that we start earlier with the implementation of the investment methodology, and we will with their feedback we will refine even more the methodology document, and further efforts are going forward the development of the investment plan methodology, which will be the next step that will take the investment strategy and operationalize it, identify measurable goals, including the estimation of a clearer estimation of the needs, of the costs, the benefits, and making creating the actual economic case and cost benefits analysis, for example. And with this, I conclude. Many thanks for your attention, and if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you. So we conclude the first round of presentation. Even if we are, let's say, quite a little bit late, I will take the chance to take just a couple of questions, because I see that most were already answered in the Q&A Q&A session, Q&A box, sorry. So I don't know, Stephen and Fred, if you are still with us. Okay, thank you,
Yes.
because yes, I would also take the chance, Fred, firstly with you. There is a question, could you please elaborate on the affordability of such insurance offers? So if you can provide like a brief answer in a couple of minutes.
Yes, I mean, there's much more information, of course, in the report, but and it is really something which is related to this single region and country, which offers are there. And it seems to be that, for example, you have some of this very nice bundled offers in Scandinavia, like Norway and Finland, and also in some other countries, but in others not. And you really have to look at, in the end, the country where you are the insurer. And it might be a bit, quite an effort, say, to really ask one insurer after the next, what do you offer? What is offered as such? You, of course, have also the insurance associations, which then are an umbrella for the countries and where the insurers are part of. And also there you would possibly get more information. So this is really something you have to have a look at the location, area, region, country where you are.
Thank you. And then moving to also regarding the next question, also regarding insurance, but would like to, let's say, hear the opinion both from Stephen and then from Linda. So the question is, insurance can be seen as an alternative to investing in the implementation of climate adaptation measures. So, so the implementation of adaptation measure obviously is something required now by regulation, such as the taxonomy. So the question is, in what way could insurance as an alternative climate adaptation option be integrated into the regulation properly to function as an element which enables regulatory compliance the same way as actual adaptation measures do? So firstly, Fred and, sorry, Stephen, and then Linda, please.
That's kind of a complicated question, but I mean, it's not unrelated to the question of unaffordability or affordability. I think the insurance industry, I think that one of the challenges that they're facing isn't so much put it this way, it's whether or not something can be insured at all. On one hand, the risks are becoming more systemic, so in a way it challenges the whole idea of mutualization as well. Second, in key sectors to society like agriculture, for example, already now insurance schemes are often subsidized by the state. Yeah, at a very basic level, when we finance things, if you go and get a financing for your house, you will be asked to have fire insurance. In a way, it's already there. And in the insurance industry, there's also some idea that maybe financing can function, also insurance can function as a kind of contingent capital in the capital stack. But of course, this works if it's a purely financial question. And if it's about market risk, for example, if the wind doesn't blow or if something breaks, then it has a financial consequence. But when we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about lives, reputations, we're talking about compliance. And insurance doesn't really touch those issues very well. But I think already now, slowly, there is a regulatory push from the top with the requirement for national adaptation plans, flood risk management plans, and so on and so on. So we will see a lot more regulatory pressure and framing. But paying for insurance can simply become not purely a matter of that particular beneficiary, because it can become unaffordable. And therefore, often you will see state intervention in some form.
Thank you, Stephen. And then Linda, if you want also to provide your thoughts on this, please.
All right, yes. So I will speak from the sort of taxonomy and CSRE perspective on this. And in fact, both of these regulations already endorse insurance as an adaptation measure, or better put, it doesn't exclude it. Adaptation as a measure is absolutely equal to any other adaptation measure EU might put in place, physical, non-physical solutions. It is in no way excluded. Under EU taxonomy, you can be aligned under the adaptation objective in a couple of different ways, but the most common way is by assessing your climate change risks, identifying the key risks, and addressing your risks. And what the criteria say, you can implement physical and non-physical solutions. And insurance would typically be one of a non-physical measure types. So there is no reason why you would not consider insurance as somehow ineligible under taxonomy. The same in CSRE, there is no exclusion. Now, when Fred talks about that there's an opportunity for insurance providers to incentivize implementation adaptation measures by providing discount and premiums if you implement adaptation measures. The other side of that is moral hazard. If they do not do that, then what we can kind of go into is over-reliance on insurance alone, that no one is making their homes more resilient anymore, or companies are not implementing any measures. They're simply over-relying on insurance. Now, it's always better to avoid being impacted than being impacted and then try to rebuild by being compensated and rebuild that. And so what some of the regulation says, and specifically taxonomy says, when you do implement insurance as your adaptation measure, we need to apply certain safeguards. And these safeguards are defined in a taxonomy. There's a specific activity for non-life insurance related to climate hazards that has criteria that avoid these types of moral hazards and other potential harms as well. So it's absolutely included, it is supported, but there are certain boundaries around to avoid certain potential harms.
Thank you, Linda. Fred, do you want to add something so we can close the first round of Q&A? No, that's fine. Okay, because I saw your hand. Okay. Thank you. So thank you. So now let's move to the second part of the webinar. So now let's talk about the financing, climate finance for nature restoration. So let's start with the first presentation. So I kindly ask Rolf Hogan to present the work they are carried out under the Waterlands project. So Rolf, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. Is that working? Oops.
Yes, but you need to put in presentation mode.
Hang on just a second. Sorry. Sorry, I can't find that. It's down here. So, okay, there we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Rolf Hogan. I work with the Landscape Finance Lab. So we're involved in the Waterlands project, which I'm going to give you a brief on just in a second. Just to note, the Landscape Finance Lab, we're involved, a small NGO based in Austria, and we're involved in promoting financing for landscapes. So both training, capacity building, and also trying to structure landscapes so that they can bring in finance and also to work with the potential investors to invest in landscapes. So moving on, here's, so Waterlands in brief. So basically our focus is very much on restoration as opposed to adaptation. Of course, there's overlaps, but I guess the lens we're working on is really around ecosystem restoration. So this is part of the Green Deal Call. The main objective is restoring wetland sites across Europe to lay foundations for scaling into the future. So budget of just under 24 million, 5-year project. So we're focused on 6 action sites where actual restoration activities are happening, and also finance. We've then got 14 knowledge sites that we're learning from, especially the action sites are learning from, and 36 partners across the project. So basically the objectives are identifying barriers, looking at integrated solutions for actual restoration on the ground, very much community-led involvement of stakeholders, linking with the knowledge sites to inform restoration, and then developing tailored restoration and financing plans for the 6 action sites. And then there's a legacy element, which is very much around developing guidelines and tools for future scaling up across Europe. So just setting the scene, we're working, as I mentioned, with these 6 action sites. We've got, I guess, a large amount of diversity in terms of habitats. So you'll see there's a lot of peatlands, but we're also looking at estuaries, coastal lagoon, karst marsh. Big difference in size. So from about 500 hectares up to 7,000 kilometers plus. Big difference in scope in terms of some of them are the smaller sites are very much site-based as opposed to landscape-based. But others are very much taking a landscape focus and a landscape approach. The partnerships involved, again, different scales depending on the type of site, and very different stages of development. Some are quite early, quite small. Others are quite mature and well established and looking to go to the next step, if you like. Then in terms of ownership of the sites, there's also diversity, private lands, public lands, as you can imagine. Some of the sites are even transboundary. And then in terms of finance, in terms of what's, let's say, pre-existing, there's extensive amount of grants coming into the sites, public funding in many of them, and also NGO support, especially for the smaller sites that are directly financing the sites. So the next slide here is just to take you through the different sites and what we're actually doing. So on the left is the actual sites, which kind of go from the smallest to the largest. So in Bulgaria, we're working on a place called Dragoman Marsh, which is near Sofia. There it's a very small site-based, about 350 hectares site, and it's looking at restoring an old marshland. And so there we're looking at a micro contribution scheme or CSR type sponsorship. So again, small project, looking at potential, I guess, donations from the private sector. Italy, we're working in Venice Lagoon, a much larger site. Again, looking at a micro contribution scheme. There, There's obviously a huge tourist industry, so there's the idea is to work with hotels and restaurants, and so when people pay their bills, they will be asked to make a donation to the conservation of the lagoon. But that could be quite important compared to Bulgaria. I think it's in a much stronger position, and it could bring in about €500,000 a year potentially. We're also working in Estonia in the Pärnu catchment. So that's in principle sort of a landscape, if you like, so it's getting to a bigger scale, but it doesn't really have a strong landscape governance, landscape plan, etc. in place. For that site, we're looking at the potential for voluntary markets, so both carbon and biodiversity. So their carbon credits, biodiversity credits are not really in place at the moment, so we're looking at the potential there to implement those into the future. In Ireland, we've got a unpronounceable, even for Irish people, Cuilcagh Nírim, also known as Wild Atlantic Nature, which is the organization that runs it. So that's a wetland, let's say peatland site in the west of Ireland. That's very interesting in terms of that they are already receiving subsidies under the Common Agricultural Policy. So that's under the results-based payments mechanism, which has been in place in Ireland for about 20 years and been quite successful. So working with groups of small farmers who can decide how to improve their land in an ecological basis, and then get paid according to their performance. So they're scored each year by, in this case, Wild Atlantic Nature, that's the organization implementing the project. But they're very much taking a landscape approach. So there's very strong connection with the farmers. There's very strong interest from the farmers in the scheme. And what we're looking at there is to see if we can develop let's say, a voluntary market supplement on top of the cap payments that are being received. So farmers go beyond the maximum of what's expected under the cap scheme, that they could potentially then receive payments or they would generate, let's say, carbon credits or biodiversity credits, and there'd be potential for private sector investors to come in and invest in those. So we're working closely with the Peatland Finance Ireland, which is a national level initiative in Ireland, which has developed an Irish peatland standard. So the idea is that we would link the scorecard with that standard, which is going through public consultation at the moment and should be online early next year. But we would form the mechanism, the aggregation mechanism with the farmers, hopefully building on what Wild Atlantic Nature is doing already. So they could actually be the aggregation mechanism, but that's sort of in discussion. And they would then be able to bring in the investments or be the conduit, if you like, for the investment from the private sector and the distribution to the farmers. Then in the Netherlands, we're working on the Ems-Dollard estuary. So the Ems-Dollard is very interesting. That's where we get a transboundary. We're only working on the Netherlands side, but there is a lot of activity also in the Wadden Sea in Germany and up as far as Denmark. But there's quite a lot of public funding already. They're looking at restoration, but also raising agricultural land, which is subsiding at the moment. And which also has peat. There's a peat layer there, so we're looking at raising that land by taking sediment from the estuary, which is a major drive of the restoration project there, because there's a lot of sediment in the estuary, which is negative for biodiversity. And the idea is that some of that sludge would be used for raising the land, and then there could potentially be carbon credits generated on the basis that the peat would no longer degenerate and no longer give emissions from oxidization. So there we're looking at supplementing a large amount of public funding that's already coming in and funding much of the restoration activity. And there we're looking at establishing a fund that would be able to bring in basically public funding, but also private sector funding through carbon credits around the peat, but also potentially sustainable agriculture into the future, and potentially biodiversity credits as well from some of the areas that are showing uplift in biodiversity from the restoration. And then finally, the very large site, the one that's sort of 7,000 square kilometers, is the Great North Bog in the UK. And that's actually an amalgamation of 6 existing partnerships in the north of England that are looking at peatland restoration. And the idea is for them is to sell, let's say, the Great North Bog as an entity. And the idea is that they can bring in, they can show, let's say, broader landscape benefits from the restoration, and also bring in a larger scale of investment. So with them, we're helping them to establish a legal entity, so working through the governance, the different types of organizational options. But the idea is that that entity would act as a special purpose vehicle where investment could come in for the whole Great North Bog and then be used for restoration. So that could be, there's a UK peatland carbon standard. So it could be for carbon credits, but also for water benefits and other types of benefits. Also, in the UK and in Ireland, we're also seeing that there's a lot of companies that are interested to invest, or let's say support conservation or restoration projects without necessarily getting benefits back in terms of having an actual bankable projects. So we can call that CSR or sponsorship or donations. But it seems to be an important element as well for funding sites, even at a larger scale. So,
Rolf, sorry,
yep.
you can move on, and
Yep.
then okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is the final slide. Yeah, so very briefly then, looking across all these sites, some of the key elements that need to be in place for looking at investment is obviously governance. Having a strong partnership is really important. Having clear vision, strategy for landscape level, looking at your costs and benefits and being able to articulate those and be able to measure change and uplift through a standard, etc. And then also identifying bankable projects. In many of the sites, it's a challenge, frankly, in developing or identifying bankable projects, and then being able to to pitch and report into the private sector as they work, and try and bring in financing. And just in terms of conclusions or food for thought, it seems that, you know, of all we're working with a lot of people on sites, even also outside of the wetland or the Waterlands project, and it seems that they are pretty much ready for scaling. There's a lot of strong landscape initiatives. There's clear benefits from the restoration, and maybe it's a strong place where there could be focus at European level. Blended finance, I think across all of the sites, we're looking, it's important to have public financing. It's not going to be just private financing. Broader non-market benefits, or let's say non-bankable benefits, are really important. And it seems that there's a strong motivation from the private sector to invest in restoration without getting the returns. It's possible to start small. So the example of Bulgaria, there are initiatives that can be taken even at a small scale. But in order to reach scale, obviously the landscape approach is really key. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rolf. And then let's conclude with let's say last presentation before the final Q&A. So I will give the floor to Shiri Zeman Shamir, so we'll present the work carried out under the REST-COAST project. Shiri, the floor is yours.
Yeah, 1 minute. Okay, now you see it, presentation, right?
Yes, please.
Okay, so thank you very much. And like Chiara said, now we are going to focus on a specific pilot site to understand exactly the challenges and opportunities when we want to apply the nature-based solution business models. So I will just tell you about the project in brief. The REST-COAST project aims to address the coastal ecosystem degradation by advancing restoration practices, risk assessment tools, and innovative financial models to upscale actually the restoration efforts. So through a series of a pilot project, we have different pilot sites in this project from mainly from Europe, but also from Israel. And we have different climate regime areas in order to learn more how to apply efficiently the nature-based solution. But mainly the main reason to have this project is actually to promote solutions to increase the biodiversity and to mitigate the climate change. So Nahal Dalia, it's actually, when we want to translate it to English, is Dalia Stream. It is located in Israel, encompasses 32 hectares estuary and coastal marsh with rich biodiversity. We support this area, variety of species, including migratory birds. We have endemic fish, and also you can see we have the soft shell turtle. The site also provides lots of ecosystem services like flood protection, groundwater recharge, and recreational opportunities. But with this saying this, now if we are looking at this area, we are here, the Nahal Dalia. In blue, you can see the reserves, the natural reserves itself, but in the green areas are all fish farms. And this is, we can see from 1980s that Nahal Dalia biodiversity have been increasingly degraded. And this is lots of species, and the habitat itself suffered from two main reasons. The first reason is the changes in water regime and the limited connectivity due to the stream dam. We have the dam here. You can see it's difficult to see it here. And also because of pollution from the fish ponds. You can see here, this is in yellow. This is the natural reserve. Here it's the connection to the coastline. I hope you see my mouse, and all of these are actually the fish farms that affect and pollute and also use the fresh water. So now we understand the main issues. We have biodiversity loss. We have polluted water from the fish farms. We have also intensified the water abstraction, which actually affect the groundwater and make them desalinated them actually. And in this case, we started to think what will be the solutions? What are the nature-based solution or bioengineering solution that we can improve the state of this area, this pilot? So we focus on several restoration efforts. The first one is to remove the dam. We want to eliminate barriers and to restore natural water flows, improving habitat connectivity for fish and other species. The second one is to think about what are we going to do with with water. So we talked about water flow restoration. We are thinking about another effort is to create a water reservoir in order to restore the rainwater and the water from the stream itself, to effluent the treatment, to treat the effluent, and also to restore the coastal habitat functions and rewild the fish farms. Later on, we will understand why. I bet you know, especially for carbon sequestration. So as I mentioned, we have the coastal degradation, which means that we face lots of problems, lots of issues that affect the area. But when we think about restoring this region, so we can think about the economic benefits to the society and what are the social benefits. In this case, when we apply the EU and the global policies like the Green Deal and Paris Agreement, we promote in the area the nature-based solution together with the INPA, it's the Israeli Natural Park Authority, and other characteristics that are very important to our process. I will tell you about them later. And all of this actually combined with the societal challenges of nature-based solution, mainly climate resilience and biodiversity loss. So if we are looking about the financing mechanism and how we try to apply to our pilot site, so we have 3 stages. The first stage is starting point. We look at existing business models, and the second is the extension one. We are looking at short-term business model and the long-term. But now I have a surprise for you, because we don't have any existing business models to this area. So we need to create a new one. And we need first to identify who are stakeholders, who is involved, who are enablers, and all of this. So by doing this, we created together with some key players, Kibbutz Maayan Tzvi, Kibbutz Magan Michael, INPA, and Reichman University, together with the team of Working Group 3 of the REST-COAST. We try to create a business model for scaling the intervention for the next 5 years. And we also suggest a 10 years plan to implement things we want. So you can see here, we have, this is the Difle, it's the Nahal Dalia natural reserves bodies. You can see that we want to increase it by using the fish ponds. And here, when we look at the rewilding for additional fish ponds, you can see that we also will use abandoned fish ponds. Here you can see a dam. We will construct and restore the estuary and increase the coastal connectivity. So by using this financial mechanism, you can see here that we try to map who are our funders, financer, what do they gain. And this was actually a challenge, because it's not a private land, but it's not a public land. It belongs to the kibbutz, and the kibbutz actually, another kibbutz, Magan Michael, leased this area in order to have the fish farm, and we have the municipality of the region. So we need to connect all of them and to explain them why we want to promote this and why we want actually to upscale the things. So when we are looking about who are the investors and the funders, so we first need to map the buyers of the ecosystem services, which are actually the Kibbutz Maayan Tzvi and Kibbutz Magan Michael, because they can act as buyers for fish provisioning, water quality, water quantity, and also potential of carbon sequestration using the carbon market. We also need to think who will be the investors of this capital, and where can we get the money? Who will invest in this specific restoration process? Now these days, it's we don't have yet, but when we are thinking about funding, so we have 3 main characteristics. The first one is the INPA, based on the REST-COAST funding, but also from other funds that they received. The Natural Water Authority and the Natural Water and Drainage Authority, which actually benefit from the restoration, but indirectly, and the Fund of Preservation of Open Areas, which related to the Land Authority. So these are the funding sources that we can have in order to implement the restoration.
Shiri, if you can move on so we can.
I almost finished.
Thank you.
Yeah, when we think about how can we get an extra money, so we can think about 3 points. The first one is the tourism user fee, because we want to create a bird watching natural reserves in order to increase also the recreation services and carbon credits, as I mentioned. This is why we are rewilding the fish ponds, and Also, project bundling, it's like combining all the stakeholders that are relevant and can understand the potential income from restoration. So, as I mentioned, at the time horizon of 5 years, we want to upscale it and we want to increase the area, but also to apply to different wetlands and estuaries in Israel in order to learn more and to implement this. And just to finish, I would like to thank to my colleagues, Umberto, Laura, Geula, my PhD student, Shaili from AGMA, from the Israeli Lakes and Water Center, and the other colleagues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shiri. Thank you for this interesting presentation. So, just a last question before closing the webinar. I can see, Rolfi, if you can stop sharing the screen, please, because I still see your presentation. So thank you. And Rolf, if you are still with us, there is just one question for you. So which are the main factors determining which financing mechanisms are adopted in the different action sites?
Okay, I mean, short answer is kind of these setting the scene slide from my presentation kind of went through those. So it depends on the size, the size of the area, the habitat, and even what's there potentially in terms of carbon credits, etc., biodiversity uplift, what potential there is, but also the partnership that's in place. If there's a good stable partnership in place that can look and start to develop some of these options, and then identifying what's potentially there for a business case or for a bankable projects, etc. So a lot of factors, and it's all very much depends on the site, and for each site we would look at a different approach.
Thank you, Rolf. So now we are moving to, let's say, the closing of this webinar. It's almost 12 o'clock. So I would really thank all the speakers for being with us during this, let's say, 2 hours webinar, providing insights and inputs on, let's say, on the different mechanisms and tools on climate finance, both for climate adaptation and for nature restoration. I would really thank all the participants that stay with us online for their active participation and for all the questions they provided. As mentioned, all the presentation and the recording of this webinar will be available, and then we will follow up with you on more detailed information on how and where they will be available. So that's it from our side. So I thank you again for staying with us, and wish you a nice rest of the day, and keep in touch and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.